One of the most enticing things to do as a chess player is to learn the opening, to spend most of your time studying the opening, studying known variations, working on traps, figuring out new ideas of your own so that you can get people without even having to play a move, just to win by your knowledge alone. It's a very enticing thing to do. And often if you don't study the openings very much, what you'll notice is that you're trapped often. Somebody plays something against you that you haven't seen before. I really believe that it's a mistake to spend too much time studying the opening, because the opening isn't chess. It's memorization. The meat of chess, the truly beautiful part of chess, the enigma of the game, lies in the endgame, where the board is more empty, and things are about detachment more than they're about tactics and mathematics. If you study the endgame, you gain an understanding of the pieces. By studying a rook alone, you'll learn about the rook. By studying the king, the pawns, you'll grow to understand, have a connection, have a relationship with those pieces. And then when you come back and you play the middle games and openings, you'll have a much firmer sense for what you're dealing with. But sometimes it's good to work on an opening, and in this next game, which we're going to look at, I was playing against a master named Todd Luna. The game was held in Centenary College in early 1996. The time control in this game was game 60. We had only 60 minutes to make all the moves. And I played an opening which is a pretty novel one, something that I've worked out, in which I handled a certain type of position in a very unorthodox way. The opening was the French defense. E4, E6, D4, D5. The basic idea of the French is to challenge in the center right away. Usually a structure will come where eventually white plays with E5. And so he has a slight spatial advantage. Black will play with C5, C3, try to undermine the base of the pawn chain. With knight C6, queen B6, try to hit the D4 pawn. White will defend that pawn and slowly build up castle kingside and try to build up a kingside attack while maintaining the structural solidity. But I chose a different plan. I developed this opening actually with my friend Maurice Ashley a number of years ago. It's a very interesting response to the French defense, which is also stylistically uncomfortable for players who play the French. And you have to always think about the psychological reality of the game. People who play the French defense are usually guys who like slow positional games in which they have a clear plan of counterattack on the queen side in the French defense. But I played e takes d5, e takes d5, c4. And immediately he's thrown off of his plan. The game is suddenly open instead of closed. And French players usually like closed games. And also, the game is not of the nature that a French player would usually like, which is very important. And I often will think about the feeling, the psychological moment of my opponent and respond to that. And so this opening tends to be uncomfortable for French players. The idea is that we're going to eventually move into a position of the isolated d-pawn. If you take off black's d and white's c pawns, you'll see that white is left with an isolated pawn. A pawn that has no one next to it, meaning there's no white e-pawn or white c-pawn. And it's on an open file, so eventually it could be attacked rather forcefully. The basic plans in the isolated pawn positions are for black, the player in this game who's playing against it, to occupy the d5 square, which is a real hole. White can't control that square. So say black puts a knight on d5 and another knight on f6. He'll usually put his pawn on c7 to c6 to further his control of the d5 square. He'll have his bishop on e7 probably and castle kingside. Black's plan will generally be to trade off material as much as possible, because to trade down when your opponent has a structural weakness can usually help you take advantage of that weakness later on. White, on the other hand, doesn't want to trade down. White wants to put a knight on e5, a bishop on d3. He wants to be castled kingside. He wants to probably have a bishop on g5 and a knight on c3, and he wants to begin a build-up on the kingside. White's play is based upon kingside pressure. Black's play is based upon the d5 square and an eventual endgame advantage he's hoping for. I personally very much enjoy playing with the isolated pawn. And in this opening, in this game, I played a plan which is rather unique against the isolated pawn. The isolated pawn is traditionally considered to be a weakness, and often people have a stereotype of the isolated pawn as a weakness, but I don't consider it to be a very real weakness. And very strong players understand that often, even if everything goes against the isolated pawn, it's still not so bad. Still, your advantage is only slightly worse if you reach an endgame in which all that's left is the isolated pawn and, say, bishops or knights. The position is often still defendable. But with the isolated pawn, you get the potential for a very big attack. You get to eventually, you build up your position and head for the enemy king. It's a very exciting game because the position begins from a very basic structural imbalance, which leads to an eventual dynamic, which can be very exciting to play with. And so the idea of the exchange French that I play with c4 is, after he played knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, my plan is to put my bishop on d3 and my knight from g to e2, which is very different from how people usually play it. Usually white will put the knight, as I mentioned, from f3 to e5. Take advantage of that square. So white will usually take the e5 square and give the d5 square. My plan is different. The way I play it is I challenge his d5 square with a knight on f4, and I play against his bishop on c8. This is the main theme of this opening, playing against the light squared bishop of black. We'll see that later on. After bishop d3, he played d takes c4 to move into the structure. You can notice also that, of course, he could have played d takes c4 when my bishop was still on f1, but he would lose a tempo. You have to take advantage of every little thing. I couldn't play the plan of bishop d3 and knight g e2 without moving my bishop first, so I had to play bishop d3. So I give up a tempo to reach the plan that I want. Bishop d3, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, castles, knight g e2. My plan. Black plays knight bd7, a classical idea. He wants to put his knight on b6, he wants to play c6, occupy the d5 square. He's not really sure what I'm doing yet. I castle, he plays knight b6, bishop b3, and he plays the move c7 to c6. His point being, he wants to further his control of d5 before he comes there. c6 is the correct move. In this position, I play rook f1 to e1, which is a very important move. It's a waiting move in a sense. I'm waiting for black to show his plan. He has two possibilities. He can either occupy the d5 square right away, or wait before doing it. The only way to wait before doing it, really, is to move his c8 bishop. The key to my plan with white is that I'm playing against the movements of his light squared bishop, which we'll see later in this game and in the following game against Aviv Friedman. Let's take a moment and try to understand what happens if he plays knight b to d5. Takes the square right away. My plan is to play knight f4. Attack the piece. Suddenly we see that I've handled this opening differently from how people usually handle the positions of the isolated pawn. I have a threat. Because of my rook on e1, suddenly exposing an attack onto the e7 bishop, my threat is to trade on d5 many times. If you imagine if it's white's move, or if black, say, plays bishop f5, I'm threatening knight takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes d5. After black plays queen takes d5, he's left his bishop on e7 unguarded, and I take it, and I've won a pawn. So by playing knight f4, I'm threatening a pawn, and he has to decide how to defend against it. If he takes on c3, I play b takes c3, and I no longer have the isolated pawn. And I do have a very strong center, and we'll slowly build up my position. White is clearly better here. By responding to my threat on the d5 square, he gave up my weakness, or my potential weakness, of the isolated pawn. And his final option is to take on f4. Then I take back with my bishop. He's helped me to develop. And you notice that his main plan of controlling the d5 square against the isolated pawn is no longer possible. Can't do it. I control the d5 square. I'm even threatening to play d4 to d5 to trade off pawns and to take an active position in a symmetrical pawn structure. My pieces are more active than his. Notice that if he plays knight f6 to d5, I can still take the pawn. His bishop on e7 is undefended. And one final thing that you should notice is if black manages to play knight takes d5 and I can't take the pawn, or I choose not to, knight takes d5, c takes d5. Look at the position where it's this exactly symmetrical pawn structure. Except I play queen f3, and the only way for him to defend the d5 pawn is to play bishop e6. In this position, with the pawn structure exactly the same, white is better, because I have an active bishop on b3, and he has a passive bishop on e6. My pieces are more active, and he has a big target on d5. White has a clear advantage here. This is the basic idea of my opening. I've had tremendous success with it over the years. In this game, my opponent chose not to occupy the d5 square right away, but to play bishop to g4, which seems like a good place for the bishop. But I challenge it, f2 to f3, breaking the pin on my knight on e2 and attacking the piece. Now a question is put to the bishop where to go. If bishop h5, I can play knight f4, attacking the piece and winning it eventually. Bishop comes back to g6. I can take on g6, and after h takes g6, you see that this pawn on g6 is very weak, because you remember from the last game, the pawn on f7 is really pinned. He's lost his light-squared bishop, which means my light squares will be very strong. And eventually I'm going to build up a big attack and maybe win the g6 pawn. It's very important also to understand that when a bishop goes, the counterpart to that bishop becomes stronger. If he loses his light-squared bishop, my light-squared bishop becomes stronger, because there's nothing for him to challenge it with. So after I played f3, he played bishop back to f5. I challenged the bishop again, knight to g3. This is all the idea of the opening. Where can the bishop go? He really has two options. He can come to g6, or he can come to d7. Bishop e6 is obviously very bad. He just loses a pawn on e6. It's attacked twice and defended once. If the bishop comes back to g6, I play the idea f3 to f4. A kind of strange idea at first. My threat is to play f5 and win the bishop on g6. This position we'll analyze in the next game against Aviv Friedman. We in fact had this exact position through a slightly different move order. Luna decided something else. He played bishop back to d7. And you already feel the nature of what I've done, the power of what I've done. His two bishops are ridiculous. On e7 and d7, they do nothing but block the activity of his own queen. His pieces are completely unharmonious. And I'm ready now to slowly build up my game. Also notice that his bishop on d7 blocks the queen's control of the d5 square. But now my plan is going to be different. I'm going to attack on the king side. I played the move queen d1 to d3. You know by now which way I like to go. My queen is on the h7 square. Eventually that'll become very important, maybe. He has to figure out what to do. My rook on e1 has a potential attack on the e7 square. The bishop is only defended by his queen. It's very important to feel the nature of potential in chess. This is something which can bother him a little bit. He has to worry about it. He decided to alleviate that pressure by playing rook f8 to e8. And now, by playing rook to e8, remember what he left behind. The f7 square. He defended the e7 square, but left something. The f7 square will become weaker a little later on. I played the move bishop c1 to g5. This move is useful for a number of reasons. For one thing, it helps to take away the defender of the h7 square. My plan once again will be bishop b3 to c2 on the h7 square, threatening bishop takes f6 and queen takes h7 with an eventual checkmate. The other idea is if he was planning on moving his bishop on e7, he can't do that anymore because he's going to be suddenly afraid of a pin on the knight on f6. Very uncomfortable. If his bishop moves anywhere, f8 or d6, I can play knight c to e4, and his knight on f6 is in big trouble. I'm going to take it and mess up his pawn structure. He couldn't deal with the pressure on his king side, and he played h7 to h6. His best move would be to play knight f to d5 to try to alleviate the pressure. And once again, it comes back to defending correctly in chess. It's very, very important to maintain a cool head when you're being attacked. Knight f6 to d5 is a very hard move to make because what you're doing is you're leaving the king side. But this is something which often is very important to do. When you're being attacked on the king side, it's very hard to move your only defensive piece away from the king side. But if you calculate that you can do it, then sometimes it's all right. Let's try to understand the move, knight f6 to d5. Your initial reaction may be, what kind of terrible move is that? I agree, it looks pretty bad. But what is the sense behind it? He wants to trade off his bishop on e7 for my bishop on g5. That's his idea. Remember, black wants to trade down pieces when he has the isolated pawn. But his knight on f6 has left the h7 square, has it not? So should I play bishop to c2 maybe? If I play bishop to c2, I'm threatening checkmate. Queen takes h7 check, king f8, queen h8 checkmate. If he takes my bishop on g5, it's still mate because my rook guards the e7 square. He really has only one move, g7 to g6. Now I would play bishop g5 to h6 probably, avoiding a trade. I probably don't want to trade down, right? Because he has the isolated pawn. Bishop h6. And now in this position, white is slightly better. I'm going to take a piece to e4 now. Maybe I can bring a piece to c5, take advantage of his dark squares. White is slightly better, but black is still alive. The way to defend is to maintain a clear head. If when you're attacked, you feel the heat of the battle, you feel the heat of the pressure, and you get nervous and you fall under that heat, then you have no way of ever succeeding. You need to have the ability to maintain clarity when under pressure. And here I use the tactic which I used in the last game. And the reason I'm showing these first two games is because I want you to learn the theme of the pinned defender, because it'll come in handy in all of your games in the future, and it also will come in handy in the games which we'll look at later on. After h6, what do you think I played? I took it. Bishop takes h6. G takes h6, and I know you know the move by now. Queen g6 check. The pawn on f7 is pinned. There's nothing he can do. His king side looked solid a moment ago. His pawns were on f7, g7, and h7. But he couldn't deal with my pieces which were near his king side. He played h6. I took it, and suddenly my queen is breathing on him. His king is getting roasted slowly. If he plays king f8 as mate in 1, queen takes f7, checkmate. His only move is king h8. And now you have a real good position. You've sacrificed a piece for a big attack. Your queen is inside his king position, but now you have to play the correct moves, because one mistake in chess can often be fatal. And when you're better, when you're attacking, your opponent's resources are very real. They're there. He's looking for them. You just can't allow them. You have to win the one game correctly. What should you do? If queen takes h6 check, which is the most tempting move, black will play knight back to h7. If bishop c2, threatening checkmate on h7, he can block that diagonal by playing f7 to f5, and now you suddenly notice that white's attacking pieces are slowly growing thin. Next move may be bishop e7 to g5, attacking the queen on h6. Queen on d8 can come to f6 soon. Black is defending. Check is not mate, my friend. You don't want to take a pawn with check whenever you can. Often you need to look for the best move. Queen takes h6 will be an immediate threat to the king, but it would not be the best move because it allows black chances to defend. I played bishop b3 takes f7, bringing another piece into the attack. I maintained the threat of queen takes h6. Often it's very important to maintain the threat. The threat is often stronger than the execution in chess. The reality for black of having to defend against 2 or 3 things can make the attack devastating, while if I seize onto one of those 3 things which he needs to defend against, he'll simply respond and not have to worry about anything anymore. What does black have to worry about here? My immediate threat is queen takes h6 check. Knight will come back to h7, I'll play bishop back to g6, threatening the pinned defender. There's nothing he can do, and that'll be mate. How can he defend the h6 square? Bishop e7 to f8 is a logical move. But I saw when I played bishop takes h6 actually that in this position I have a winning move. What did the bishop coming back to f8 leave? What does he not control that he controlled last move? You remember that question from before. He now controls the h6 square, but he's blocked the defense of the g8 square. The rook on e8 no longer controls the g8 square. And also he's given up a little bit of control of the f6 square. What is my move? Knight on g3 to h5. Wins the game. If he trades rooks on e1, it makes no difference. If he plays knight takes h5, queen g8 is checkmate. If he plays bishop on f8 to g7, queen takes g7 is checkmate. If bishop on f8 to e7, queen to g7 is checkmate. There's no way for him to guard the knight on f6. My threat is simply knight takes f6. And to defend all the different mates. He's lost. He played the move knight b to d5. His idea being, after I play queen takes h6 check, knight to h7, bishop to g6, threatening queen takes h7 checkmate, to play knight d5 to f6, bringing back another piece, all the way from the queen side back to the king side. Now he's actually succeeded in defending the h7 knight. That's what his idea is. How do you stop that idea? His defense is hanging on by a thread, but in fact it's not strong enough. My knight on c3 isn't really doing anything, and his knight on d5, as we just said, is a very important defensive piece. I just play knight c3, takes d5. If it takes back with the knight, queen takes h6 is checkmate right away. His only move is c takes d5. I play queen takes h6 check, only move knight h7. By now you know what to do with the pinned piece. Attack it. Bishop f7 to g6. There's no way to defend mate in 2. If he plays king g8, I play queen takes h7 check, king f8. There are 2 ways to roast him, queen h8 mate and queen f7 mate. The party's over. And he resigned.